The day Theresa Maddox drove her wagon off the edge of what most decent folks called common sense, the wind out of New Mexico territory was blowing so hard it ripped the hat clean off old Reverend Crane's head and sent it tumbling into the Rio Puico. And that, the townspeople of Cielo Rojo would later say, was God's own sign that something unstoppable had arrived. It was the spring of 1882, and Cielo Rojo was exactly the kind of town that liked its women quiet, its cattle fat, and its opinions settled before sundown. It sat low against the mesa like a dog that had learned to expect kicks, its single main street pocked with horse tracks and dried mud, its buildings leaning into one another for comfort against the desert wind. There was a general store run by a man named Horace Webb who watered his flower and knew everybody's business. There was a saloon called the Painted Crow, where the piano was missing 3 keys and the whiskey was missing any pretense of quality. There was a jail with a door that never quite latched, a church with a cross that tilted 12 degrees east, and a livery stable that smelled like every bad decision a horse had ever made. And at the far end of the street, anchoring the whole affair like a monument to stubbornness, sat the land office run by one Gerald Fitch, who also served as the town's unofficial judge of what was appropriate and who was allowed to do what with whom and when. Theresa Maddox had no patience for any of it. She pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the land office on the 22nd of April, 1882, climbed down from the buckboard without waiting for anyone to offer a hand, smoothed the front of her plain brown dress as though she were brushing away the last 300 miles of trail dust, and walked through Gerald Fitch's door like she owned the walls. She was 27 years old. Her hair was dark, the color of strong coffee before cream, and she wore it braided and pinned at the back of her neck because she had no time for it otherwise. Her eyes were the particular gray-green of storm clouds building over the Sandia Mountains, and she had the kind of face that was not conventionally pretty so much as entirely unforgettable. Her hands were calloused. Her boots were worn but maintained with care. Everything about her spoke of a woman who had been taking care of her own affairs for a long time and had gotten very good at it. Gerald Fitch looked up from his papers, took one look at her, and immediately adopted the expression he reserved for complicated situations, which was to say he looked like a man who had just discovered a rattlesnake in his left boot while his right foot was still bare. "I'm here to file a claim," Theresa said. She placed a folded document on his desk. "The Harmon parcel, northeast corner, 240 acres running down to the creek bed." Gerald Fitch cleared his throat. Mrs. Maddox," she said. "Theresa Maddox. Mrs. Maddox." He cleared his throat again, which was a habit he had when buying time. "The Harmon parcel is, well, it's been spoken for, in a manner of speaking." "In what manner of speaking?" "Well, Warren Callum has had his eye on that land since old Jeb Harmon passed in January." "Warren Callum's eye is not a legal claim," Theresa said. "This is the Homestead Act. I have the filing fee. I have the form. I intend to work the land. All I require from you is your signature and your stamp." Gerald Fitch looked at the form. He looked at Theresa. He looked at the form again. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this is rough country out here. The land on the Harmon parcel is not broken. The soil is hard. There are no structures. It's not, shall we say, suitable for a woman alone." Theresa's jaw tightened the way a good knot tightens under strain, which is to say it became only more secure. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I broke 60 acres of Texas hardpan by myself after my husband died of fever 3 years ago, ran the farm for 2 seasons, sold it at a fair price, and drove here from Tucson over 12 days of trail with no escort because the man I hired quit in Albuquerque because I wouldn't turn back after a thunderstorm. I am not looking for your opinion on suitability. I am looking for your stamp." Gerald Fitch, to his credit, recognized the particular quality of immovable when it sat across his desk and looked at him. He stamped the form. By the time the sun went down that evening, all of Cielo Rojo knew about it. And by the time the moon came up, the consensus was unanimous. Theresa Maddox was the most stubborn woman who had ever made the mistake of setting foot in this valley. Warren Callum heard about it in the Painted Crow and ordered 2 drinks in close succession, which for him was a declaration of war. He was 41 years old, built thick through the shoulders, with a drooping black mustache and landholdings that already ran 6 miles in either direction. He had been expanding methodically, parcel by parcel, for the last 8 years, and the Harmon land sat in the middle of his operation like a tooth he needed pulled. He had assumed it was simply a matter of time and Gerald Fitch's cooperation, both of which had seemed reliable until a woman in a brown dress had walked through the door. "I want to know who she is," he said to his foreman, a lean and weathered man named Dix Hollowell, "and I want to know by morning." Dix Hollowell knew who she was by midnight, because in a town the size of Cielo Rojo, information traveled at roughly the speed of a sneeze. He reported back that Theresa Maddox was a widow from Tucson, originally out of San Antonio, that she had a reputation in the places she'd been for being extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily difficult depending on who you asked, that she had no family in the territory, no male connections of note, and that she had camped on the Harmon land that very night in her wagon rather than pay for the hotel. Warren Callum turned this information over in his mind and decided that the situation called for patience followed by pressure. He was not, he told himself, an unreasonable man. He would approach her. He would make an offer. Surely she would see sense. He had not yet met Theresa Maddox. The following morning, Alfred Malone rode into Cielo Rojo from the north, which was a direction most people avoided because the north road was poorly maintained, and wound through a stretch of arroyo country that was hard on horses and harder on tempers. Alfred had come from Santa Fe, where he had been working as a ranch hand on the Delgado spread for the past 2 years. He was 32 years old, lean the way people got when they worked long days and ate whatever was available, with dark copper-brown hair that had grown a little too long and needed cutting, and a quality of unhurried steadiness about him that people either found comforting or slightly unnerving, depending on how much they had to hide. His horse was a dun mare named Cora, which he had owned for 6 years, and would sooner have given up a hand than parted with. He had come to Cielo Rojo because he had heard there was work on the outlying ranches, and because Santa Fe had started to feel crowded in the particular way places feel crowded when you have exhausted their possibilities. He had no particular plan beyond finding work and a place to stable Cora that wouldn't cost more than he had, and so he rode toward the livery stable on the south end of town without much attention to the other inhabitants. He noticed the wagon parked at the far end of the street because it was a good, honest wagon, well kept, with the canvas tied in a way that suggested its owner had done it in weather and knew what they were about. He noticed it the way a man who has worked with tools and equipment for most of his life notices craftsmanship or the care of same, and he filed it away without much thought. He did not notice Theresa Maddox until the following day, and he noticed her the way you notice a fire in an open field, which is to say he was aware of it from a distance before he understood what he was looking at. She was in the general store, and she was arguing with Horace Webb. This was not, Alfred would discover, an unusual state of affairs. Theresa had been in town for 36 hours and had already argued with Horace Webb twice, with Gerald Fitch once more, and had exchanged something that stopped just short of an argument with a man named Tully Barker, who had tried to tell her the fence posts she was purchasing were the wrong gauge for the soil conditions on the northeast side of the valley. He had not been wrong, as it happened, and she had not ultimately bought the lighter gauge posts, but she had made him prove it to her satisfaction before she changed her mind, which was a distinction she considered important. Alfred stepped into the store to buy coffee and hardtack for the road, because he had learned through inquiry that the nearest ranch looking for hands was a half-day's ride east, and he stopped inside the doorway because the argument in progress was the kind that requires the full width of the floor. "You shorted me 3 pounds on the flour," Theresa was saying. She had the sack on Horace Webb's counter, and she had her hand on it with a possessiveness that suggested she would not be moving it until the situation was resolved. "Mrs. Maddox," Horace said, with the tone of a man who had been having a long week that showed no signs of improving, "the bag is sealed by the mill. I have no control over the weight. You have a scale," she said. "Use it." "Mrs. Maddox, use the scale, Mr. Webb." Alfred watched Horace Webb use the scale. The bag came up light by nearly 4 pounds, which was more than Theresa had even claimed. She stood very still for a moment, and then she looked at Horace Webb with an expression of complete and utter patience, and she said, 4 pounds 2 ounces. "I would like 4 pounds 2 ounces of flour, or I would like the proportional reduction in price, or I would like you to tell me now which you prefer so we can both get on with our morning." Horace Webb, whose face had gone the particular red of a man caught between embarrassment and defensiveness, made a sound like a horse clearing its nostrils and reached under the counter for the extra flour. Alfred bought his coffee. He bought his hardtack. He was almost to the door when Theresa turned and walked straight into him at a pace that suggested she had been moving at top speed in her thoughts if not in her feet, and his bag of coffee went sideways, and the beans scattered across the floor like the percussion section of a very small orchestra. They looked at the coffee. They looked at each other. "I apologize," Theresa said immediately, with the clipped directness of someone who took responsibility for their actions as a habit rather than a performance. "That was my fault." "It was," Alfred agreed, but he said it without any heat, and he crouched down and started picking up beans. After a moment she crouched beside him and helped, and they worked in parallel silence for 30 seconds, which is a long time to be that close to a stranger. "You are new to Cielo Rojo," she said. It was not a question. "Rode in yesterday," he said, "looking for work, looking for it in the east, the Hargrove spread." She was quiet for a beat. "Henry Hargrove is a fair man," she said. "I've heard he pays decent, doesn't cheat on feed for the horses." "That's what I heard," he said. They stood. He had recaptured most of the beans. She had recovered a respectable portion of the rest. He poured his own back into his bag, and she held out her palm with her portion, and he held the bag open and she poured them in, and for one odd, suspended moment they were both looking at his open bag and her extended hand, and the small domestic closeness of the gesture, and then she closed her fingers and pulled her hand back and he tied off the bag. "Alfred Malone," he said. "Theresa Maddox," she said, and then she was out the door with her properly weighted flour, and the morning light swallowed her, and Alfred Malone stood in the middle of Horace Webb's floor holding a bag of slightly dusty coffee beans, and thinking that Cielo Rojo might be more interesting than it had first appeared. He did not ride to the Hargrove spread that morning after all. He had Cora stabled and had taken a room at the hotel for another night, and he found himself walking to the north end of the street, and then out along the wagon track that led toward the Harmon parcel without entirely meaning to. He told himself he was getting the lay of the land. He told himself he was simply taking a ride after days of travel. Cora, who had known him for 6 years and understood his self-deception as well as anyone, twitched her ears in a way that expressed no opinion. The Harmon parcel opened up about 2 miles north of town, where the mesa pulled back, and a broad stretch of valley floor spread east toward a broken line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. It was good land in the way that difficult land is good, which is to say it would work if you worked it, and it would fight you every inch, and the fight would be worth it. The soil was heavy adobe clay at the surface, but the creek proximity meant moisture, and moisture meant the possibility of green things, and green things meant cattle or crops or both. Theresa's wagon was parked in the shelter of a small rock outcropping on the western edge of the parcel, and she was walking the land with deliberate, measuring steps, counting under her breath, and she had a notebook and a stub of pencil, and she was making marks that Alfred, from a respectful distance, could not read. He stopped Cora at the edge of the parcel and watched for a moment. She had not seen him yet. She was working a line from the cottonwoods toward the western fence line corner, stepping heel to toe, which was an old surveying trick, not perfectly accurate but good enough for planning. And she had the notebook open against her forearm, and she was making quick, confident marks. The wind had come up out of the southwest, and it pressed her dress against her legs and unraveled a strand of hair from her braid, and she pushed it aside without breaking her count. He turned Cora back toward town. He did not know why he felt it would be an intrusion to announce himself, except that he did, and he respected the feeling. That evening in the Painted Crow, he heard about Warren Callum. He heard about it from a man named Jake Prentice, who occupied the stool next to him at the bar, and had the look of a man who needed someone to tell things to. Jake was a third-generation cowhand who had worked for Callum for 2 seasons, and had recently quit over a dispute about wages that Jake considered non-negotiable, and he had opinions about his former employer. "Callum's a patient man," Jake said, turning his glass in a slow circle, "right up until he's not. He wanted that Harmon land bad. Not because it's special land, understand. Just because it's between 2 pieces of his, and he doesn't like anything between 2 pieces of his that he doesn't own." "And a woman filed on it," Alfred said. "A widow woman," Jake confirmed. "From Tucson. They say she's as stubborn as a blue norther and twice as cold, though I personally have not made her acquaintance." "She seems capable," Alfred said. Jake looked at him with the mild curiosity of a man recalibrating. "You've met her, briefly." "Well," Jake said, "capable won't matter much if Callum decides to make her life difficult. He's done it before. Old Flora's family on the south parcel, he cut off their water access through his land. Legal enough, technically, though any decent man would say otherwise. They lasted 1 dry summer and sold." Alfred turned this over in his mind. He finished his drink and went to his room and lay on the narrow hotel bed staring at the ceiling, and he had the particular restless feeling of a man who has arrived at a crossroads slightly, before he realized it was there. He rode to the Hargrove spread the next morning. Henry Hargrove was a lean, sun-creased man in his mid-50s who shook Alfred's hand with the firm grip of someone who had spent his life making assessments quickly and had gotten good at it. They talked for 2 hours. Henry offered him work at a fair rate. Alfred asked for a day to consider it, which Henry found slightly unusual but accepted with grace. On his way back through town, he stopped at the land office. Gerald Fitch looked up with the same expression he'd worn when Theresa had walked in, which Alfred was beginning to understand was simply Gerald's default state. Alfred asked him, with no preamble, what the legal situation was regarding water rights on the Harmon parcel, specifically in relation to the creek access. Gerald studied him. "You have an interest in the parcel." "An interest in understanding the law," Alfred said pleasantly. Gerald, who was not a bad man but was a man who navigated by the wind of whoever seemed most powerful in any given situation, pulled out his maps and explained somewhat reluctantly that the creek bed itself was technically on the eastern edge of the Harmon claim, but that the established right-of-way for water access crossed a corner of the Callum property to the south, and that this right-of-way was not formally recorded, which meant that in a legal dispute it was unclear. "Has Callum been told this?" Alfred asked. Gerald's face said everything his mouth declined to. Alfred thanked him and left. He found Theresa that afternoon at the general store again, this time purchasing nails and wire, and examining a catalog of farm implements with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. He stood near her, not crowding, and when she looked up he said, without any introduction because they had already done that, "The water right-of-way from your parcel to the creek crosses Callum land. It's not formally recorded." She went very still. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said carefully. "I didn't know it had been confirmed." She looked at him directly. "How do you know?" "Gerald Fitch's maps. He showed them to you." "He showed them to me," Alfred said. She considered this. "Why are you telling me?" It was the right question. It was the kind of question that only a person who had been managing their own affairs without assistance for a long time would think to ask immediately, because such a person has learned that information given freely usually has a cost attached to it. "Because it seems like something you should know," he said, and he said it the way people say things that are simply true, without decoration. She looked at him for a long moment. "I have to get this right-of-way recorded," she said, mostly to herself. "You'd need a surveyor to make it official," he said. "Nearest one is in Cielo. How far? Day and a half south." "Then I'll go to Cielo," she said, as simply as if she were announcing she intended to pour herself a glass of water. "Callum may move before you get back." "Then I'll move before I go." She closed the catalog and picked up her nails. "Thank you, Mr. Malone." "Alfred," he said. She paused. Something shifted in her face, not much, but enough. "Alfred," she said, and then she carried her nails to the counter. He accepted the job with Henry Hargrove the following morning. The Hargrove Ranch was close enough to town that he could ride in on his days off, which he told himself was not particularly relevant information, but which his subconscious filed anyway with the careful attention it reserved for things that mattered. In the days that followed, he learned several things about Theresa Maddox by way of the small, visible evidence of her life, the way a tracker learns a territory. He learned that she rose before sunrise, because he could see the lamp in her wagon when he rode past in the early gray light on his way out to the Hargrove pastures. He learned that she had begun digging out post holes along her northern fence line with a post hole digger she had borrowed from a neighboring farmer named Orville Meeks, and that she dug with a fierce, economical competence that had caused Orville himself to stop and watch with open admiration on his way past. He learned that she had written 3 letters, one to the county seat, one to a lawyer in Albuquerque whose name Alfred did not know, and one to the surveyor in Cielo, all of which she had given to the male writer with the methodical intentionality of someone executing a plan. He learned that she had gone to the Painted Crow exactly once, not to drink but to play cards, which she had done with a quality of calm and mathematical precision that had cost 3 cowboys a combined $11 before they noticed what was happening. She had walked out with the money and bought herself a better lamp from Horace Webb the next morning without a word to anyone about where the money had come from. He learned that she had not made any particular friends in Cielo Rojo because she did not have time for social niceties, and the women of the town were collectively uncertain whether to admire or disapprove of her, which resulted in a kind of hovering, cautious distance that Theresa seemed either not to notice or not to care about. He also learned, because the land talks if you know how to listen to it, that someone had knocked down the 3 fence posts she had gotten into the ground on the far east corner of her parcel. She had not mentioned this to anyone in town. She had replaced them the following day. Alfred rode to the eastern corner on his next afternoon off. The post holes were freshly dug, and the new posts were set with exactly the same care as the originals, which told him she had examined them when they were knocked over and determined nothing was wrong with her technique before doing it again. He pulled Cora up and looked at the posts and at the boot prints in the clay soil around them, which were not Theresa's, and at the marks where the posts had been leveraged out of the ground. And then he rode back to the Hargrove Ranch and thought about patience and how long it lasted. He rode into town on his next free Saturday, which was 3 weeks after his arrival, and he timed it with no particular intention, except that he arrived at the Harmon parcel just as Theresa was struggling with a 120-pound roll of wire fencing that had slipped off the back of her wagon and landed at an angle in the creekside brush, and was absolutely not going to be moved by one person, using the mechanical advantages available without losing at least an hour and some skin. He dismounted. He did not ask. He just walked to the near end of the roll and took hold of it, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and something passed between them that was not quite gratitude and not quite reluctance, but was some combination of the two with an undercurrent of something else entirely that neither of them was prepared to name. They moved the roll together. It took about 3 minutes, and the loss of no skin, which compared favorably to her original estimate. "You've been riding past my land for 3 weeks," she said when they had the wire where she needed it. "The road to Hargroves goes this direction." "It does," she allowed, "but the road goes past the north edge." "You've been riding the south edge the last 2 weeks." He said nothing. "The fence posts on the east corner," she said. "Someone knocked them over." "I know," he said. "You know who." "I have a good idea," he said. "It was Callum's men." She nodded slowly. "I figured as much." She picked up a wire stretcher and turned back to the roll. "He came to see me on Thursday." Alfred went still. "What did he want?" "He made an offer on the parcel." She did not look up from her work. $200. "The filing cost me 18. He thinks I'm desperate." "Are you?" The look she gave him was the kind that carried years of weather in it. "No," she said. "What did you say to him?" "I said I did not intend to sell." "And he said," she paused, and her hands went quiet on the wire for a moment. "He said that the territory was a difficult place for a woman without connections, and that I ought to think carefully about whether I was comfortable being without connections in it." She resumed working. "It was the politest threat I've ever received, and I've received a few." Alfred felt something tighten in him that was not quite anger, because anger was not the right shape for it. It was more like the hardening of a decision that had been forming for some time without his full awareness. "The surveyor?" he asked. "Coming in 2 weeks," she said. The lawyer in Albuquerque wrote back. "He says if I can get the right-of-way formally recorded, Callum can't touch the water access without a court fight he'd be unlikely to win. 2 weeks is a long time." "I'm aware," she said. She set the wire stretcher. She worked with the quiet focus of someone who has long since made peace with difficulty. "I don't suppose you know how to stretch fence," she said without looking up. "I know how to stretch fence," he said. "Do you have anywhere to be this afternoon?" "No." She handed him the far end of the stretcher. They worked for 4 hours. The sun went across the sky, and the shadow of the mesa crept toward them, and the New Mexico wind came and went in its unpredictable way, warm and dry, and carrying the smell of sage and something that was almost rain but was not quite. They talked while they worked, in the way people talk when their hands are busy, and the pretense of formal conversation is stripped away by simple shared labor. And Alfred learned more about Theresa in those 4 hours than most people probably learned in months. She had been born in San Antonio in 1855. Her father had been a schoolteacher, and her mother had died when Theresa was 9. And the result of these 2 facts was that Theresa had received a good education and had learned early to take care of practical matters herself because her father, while admirable in many ways, was not a practical man. She had married James Maddox when she was 22, a farming man who was also practical and decent, and who had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1879 when she was 24. And she had then managed the farm for 3 years because there was no one else to do it and no reason to stop except weakness, which she did not consider a sufficient reason. She had sold the farm and come to New Mexico territory because she wanted land that was hers, not land she had inherited or land she was managing in someone's memory, but land she had chosen and claimed and built on entirely of her own intention, and the Harmon parcel was it. She said this last part the way people state axioms, as established facts not subject to debate. Alfred told her less. He told her the broad lines. Missouri-born, had come west with his father when he was 15, had worked cattle in Texas and Colorado and New Mexico in the years since, had no family to speak of since his father died of a stroke in 1878. He told her Henry Hargrove was a good employer and that he liked the country out here, the particular drama of mesa and sky. He told her about Cora, which felt like a digression, but she listened to it with genuine interest, which told him something about her. What he did not tell her, because he was not entirely sure how to say it without it sounding like something it was not and also like something it was that he had been watching her for 3 weeks with the helpless attention of a man who has discovered, against all expectation, that the world contains something he has been looking for without knowing it. When the light went long and the shadows stretched and they had strung the better part of 100 yards of fence, they sat on opposite sides of the wagon tailgate and drank from her water jug in turn, and Theresa said, looking at the fence line, "4 more knocking over attempts and I'll be angry." 4, Alfred said. "I have a threshold," she said. "I find it's efficient to set one in advance." He laughed. It came out before he thought about it, a genuine laugh, the kind that has nothing performed about it, and she turned to look at him with an expression of slight surprise, as though she had not expected it but was not displeased. The corner of her mouth pulled up by a fraction, which on Theresa Maddox he was already learning to recognize as the equivalent of a grin. "What happens at threshold?" he asked. "I get considerably less polite," she said. The next 2 weeks moved in the way that time moves when something is building, which is to say they felt both slow and fast depending on the moment. Alfred worked at Hargrove's during the days and rode to the Harmon parcel on his free afternoons, and the fiction that he was simply passing by had dissolved sufficiently that he did not even maintain it anymore. He came to help, and Theresa accepted help with the particular grace of someone who knows the difference between accepting help and needing to be saved, and who is at peace with the former while having no patience for the latter. Together, they built a fence that any cowhand in the territory would have been satisfied to put his name to. Together they marked out where the well needed to be dug and where the cabin ought to go, the orientation taking advantage of the afternoon shadow from the rock face to the west, which would be critical in the summer heat. Together they talked, every day more, about everything and nothing, and Alfred began to understand that talking to Theresa was the most interesting thing he had done in years, possibly because she was the first person he had met in a long time who said exactly what she meant and expected the same in return. He also kept watch. He was not obvious about it, but after the fence posts on the east corner were knocked over a second time, which happened 9 days after the first incident, he began to ride a wider perimeter on his evening passes, and he had 2 long conversations with Orville Meeks, who lived on the adjacent parcel and had good eyes and a reliable memory. Orville confirmed that he had seen Dix Hollowell, Callum's foreman, riding the boundary of Theresa's parcel on 2 occasions in the past week. Alfred considered going to talk to Callum directly. He thought about it for several days with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. He ultimately decided against it, not because he was afraid of the conversation, but because Callum's quarrel was with Theresa's claim, and it was not Alfred's place to intervene in her business as though she required managing. What he could do was make sure she had the information she needed and that she was not alone when it counted. The surveyor arrived on a Thursday, a precise little man named Mr. Argello from Socorro, who wore spectacles and spoke with the careful formality of a man who had found that precision in language prevented misunderstandings in his work. He and Theresa and Alfred spent an entire day walking the perimeter of the Harmon parcel with measuring chains and stakes, and Mr. Argello made detailed notes in a leather-bound ledger and confirmed every line and angle of the claim, including, critically, the right-of-way path to the creek. The right-of-way crossed a 60-foot strip of Callum's southern boundary, in Mr. Argello's professional opinion, based on the established use of the path by the previous Harmon family over a period of at least 15 years. The right-of-way had legal standing and ought to be recorded as such. The following morning, Theresa went to Gerald Fitch's land office with Mr. Argello's official survey document and a letter from the Albuquerque lawyer and Gerald Fitch's own maps, and sat across the desk from him and laid all of it out in sequence. And when she was done, she looked at Gerald Fitch and said, with a patience that was more effective than any threat, "I would like this recorded today." Gerald Fitch recorded it that day. Word reached Warren Callum by afternoon. He arrived at the land office the following morning and had a discussion with Gerald Fitch behind a closed door that could be heard through 2 walls, and when he came out his face was a color that doctors would have found concerning. He rode past the Harmon parcel on his way back to his own land, and he stopped his horse at the fence line and looked at the fence and at the wagon and at the cabin framing that was just beginning to go up against the western rock face, and his expression was the expression of a man revising his strategy. Alfred was working fence on the north side of the parcel when Callum stopped. He watched from a distance. Callum looked at the parcel for a long time, and then he looked at Alfred, and Alfred met his gaze with the particular quality of stillness that was not aggression but was also not accommodation, and after a moment Callum rode on. That evening, Alfred sat on the tailgate of Theresa's wagon in the long amber light of a New Mexico sunset and said, "He'll try something else." "Yes," she agreed. She was sorting nails by size, which was not strictly necessary but was the kind of thing she did when she was thinking. "He's a patient man," you said. "He was. I think he may have run out of patience." "Then he'll make a mistake," she said. "Impatient men make mistakes. I just need to be prepared for what form it takes." He looked at her in the side-lit evening, the way the light caught the line of her cheek and the set of her shoulders, and he felt the accumulated weight of the past weeks pressing against something in him that had been holding a door closed. "Theresa," he said. She looked up from the nails. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I'd prefer that," she said, and there was no coyness in it. She simply meant it. "I have been coming out here every afternoon that I can get free, not just because you need the help, though you do sometimes need the help, and not just because I think Callum is a problem you shouldn't have to manage alone, though I do think that." He paused. He was a careful speaker, but this was requiring him to be careful in a different way than usual. "I come because I find that I want to. Because I find that I would rather be here than anywhere else I could think of to be." She was quiet for a moment. She set down the nails. She looked at him with those storm cloud eyes that saw everything clearly and evaluated it without sentiment, but also without coldness, and she said, "I know." "No? I've known for about 2 weeks," she said. "I was waiting to see if you would say it." She looked back toward the creek where the cottonwoods were catching the last light like small green flames. "My husband James was a good man. He was the best kind of steady. And I have not been looking for anything since him because looking felt like replacing and I did not want to replace." She paused. "But this does not feel like replacing. This feels like something different." "What does it feel like?" he asked. She was quiet for another moment. "Like something that was going to happen whether I approved of it or not," she said. He laughed softly, and she turned back, and there it was again. That fraction of a smile that meant more than a full one on someone else. And he reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his. And she turned her hand over under his and held on. And the wind came in from the southwest carrying the sage smell and the almost rain. And neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already there in the particular quality of that held silence. Callum moved on a Monday, which Alfred would later reflect was exactly the kind of day a man like Callum would choose. The beginning of the week, the furthest point from Sunday and its injunctions. He moved through legal means, which was his preference when possible, and the legal means he chose was a claim filed with the county clerk in the seat 2 days' ride east that alleged that the boundary survey of the Harmon parcel was in error, and that the right-of-way recorded by Theresa Maddox encroached on land that was properly part of the Callum holding. The claim was, on its face, baseless. But baseless claims in 1882 in New Mexico territory could tie up land rights for months, and months was all Callum needed. Without recorded water access, Theresa could not winter on the land. Without wintering, she could not meet the Homestead Act's requirements for continuous improvement and occupation. Without that, the claim became vulnerable. The letter from the county clerk arrived on a Wednesday. Theresa read it standing outside the land office where the mail came in, and Alfred watched her face go through several things in rapid sequence: recognition, analysis, anger carefully controlled, resolution. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "He's filed a boundary dispute," she said. "I know," Alfred said, because the county clerk's office talked and Cielo Rojo was a small town. Gerald told me this morning. He's trying to tie up the water access. Yes, she looked at him. I have to go to the county seat. I know. I have to go and fight this in person. How long will it take? I don't know, a week, maybe more. She looked toward her parcel, toward the framing of the half-built cabin standing against the rock face. If I leave for a week, I'll watch it, he said. She looked at him. Something complicated moved across her face. Alfred, this is my fight. I am not asking. I know you're not asking, he said. I'm offering. There's a difference. He held her gaze. You know the difference. She did know the difference. She had spent 3 years learning exactly what the difference was, and she had also learned how rarely it appeared in practice. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. I need to be back in 3 weeks. The Homestead Act requires me to be in continuous residence or actively improving. Go file your response, he said. I'll make sure the land is here when you come back. She left the next morning. She left him with the spare key to the wagon's lockbox where she kept her remaining money and the deed copies. And she left him with a list of 3 things she needed to have completed on the cabin framing while she was gone, written on a sheet of paper in her precise, school-teacher-neat handwriting. And she left him with a look when she climbed up onto the buckboard that said everything she had not yet said in words, but was getting close to being ready to say. He watched her drive south out of Cielo Rojo, and then he went back to work. The 3 weeks that Theresa was gone were the most productive of Alfred's memory in the strictly practical sense. He worked at Hargrove's during the days and spent his evenings and full free days on the Harmon parcel. And because Henry Hargrove was a decent man who had been watching the situation with Callum with quiet disapproval, Henry gave Alfred 2 full days in the middle of the 2nd week on his own time and sent 2 of his own hands with him, saying only that it seemed like there was work to be done and that hands were available. With 3 men working, the cabin framing went up in 2 days. The walls were raw lumber, the window frames were rough, the floor was still dirt, but the structure was there, solid and true. And once the walls were standing, it was inarguably a structure under construction, which was exactly the kind of evidence of continuous improvement that the Homestead Act required. Dix Hollowell came to the fence line on the 4th day Theresa was gone and stood there watching them work. Alfred watched him back pleasantly, without any particular expression, for a full 5 minutes. Then he went back to work. Hollowell rode away. On the 8th day, a man came out from town with a document that purported to be a court order suspending improvement activities pending the outcome of the boundary dispute. Alfred read it carefully. Then he rode to Gerald Fitch's office and asked Gerald to look at it with him. Gerald looked at it for a while. Then he said, carefully, "This is from the county clerk's office. Is it validly issued?" Gerald looked at it for a while longer. "It would need to be served on the property claimant," he said. "The claimant is Mrs. Maddox, and Mrs. Maddox is at the county seat," Alfred said, responding to the claim that generated this order. Gerald's eyebrows performed a complex maneuver. "I would say," he said very carefully, "that in the absence of the claimant, the order has not been validly served." Alfred thanked him and rode back and kept building. On the 15th day of Theresa's absence, he found something he had not anticipated, which was that he missed her the way you miss weather when you've had nothing but clear skies for too long. He missed her particular directness and the quality of her attention when she listened, which was the full kind, not the partial kind that most people offered. He missed the way she thought out loud when she was figuring something out, talking through the logic in a steady, methodical sequence that he found oddly comforting, like watching someone solve a puzzle piece by piece. He missed the way she sat on the tailgate in the evening light. He wrote her a letter. It was not a long letter, because he was not a long letter writer, but it covered the progress on the cabin and the situation with Hollowell and the court document. And at the end it said, in his careful, somewhat cramped handwriting, that he hoped the county business was going in her favor, and that Cora sent her regards, which was not literally true since Cora had no particular awareness of Theresa's absence, but which he thought she would understand the spirit of. The letter went south with the mail rider on Tuesday. Theresa came back on a Thursday, which was the 19th day, 3 days earlier than expected. She drove in from the South Road in the mid-afternoon, and Alfred happened to be in town at the farrier's with Cora when he heard the particular rhythm of her wagon, which he had learned to recognize, and he came out of the farrier's to see her driving up the main street with a different quality about her than when she had left, not triumphant exactly, because Theresa was not a triumphant sort of person, but resolved, settled in a deeper way than before. She saw him immediately and pulled the wagon to a stop. "The boundary claim," she said, before she was entirely down from the buckboard. The judge reviewed Mr. Argello's survey and Callum's counterclaim and found the counterclaim unsubstantiated. The right-of-way stands. Alfred let out a breath he had been holding for 3 weeks. "Good," he said. "The judge also said," she continued with a precise emphasis, "that further spurious filings against a valid homestead claim would be viewed unfavorably." She paused. He used the word spurious himself, which I appreciated. "It's a good word," Alfred agreed. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the survey lines, with the particular attention she gave to things she was assessing fully and carefully. Then she said, "The cabin framing." "It's up," he said. "Henry Hargrove's hands," he offered. "You should not have let him do that for nothing," she said. "He didn't do it for nothing. He did it because Callum tried to buy his southwest pasture 3 years ago using methods that Henry also found disagreeable, and Henry is a man who remembers his disagreements." Alfred looked at her. "Also, you can buy him a good bottle of whiskey." Something that was genuinely a smile, not just the fraction but the whole expression, arrived on Theresa Maddox's face. It was the first time he had seen it complete, and it was, he thought, one of the finest things he had seen in his life, which had contained several fine things, but this was near the top. "I received your letter," she said. "I know, the mail writer told me. About Cora's regards. I may have taken a small liberty." "You may have," she said, and then, "Alfred, yes. I thought about what you said," she said, "before I left, about coming here because you wanted to, about it feeling like somewhere you'd rather be." He waited. "I thought about it the whole drive down and while I was waiting for the judge and the whole drive back." She was looking at him directly because she had no other mode. "I thought that I have been asking myself whether I was ready for something like this, and I have realized that was the wrong question." "What's the right question?" he asked. "The right question," she said, "is whether I want it. And I do." The farrier's apprentice, who was 17 and entirely absorbed in watching this from the stable doorway, would tell the story for years afterward, as the moment Alfred Malone crossed the street in 3 steps and took Theresa Maddox's face in both hands and kissed her in front of the farrier's and the general store and anybody who happened to be looking from the windows of the Painted Crow. The boy would probably embellish over time, as stories do, but the essential facts were accurate. What was also accurate was that Theresa, who had driven 300 miles alone from Tucson and faced down Gerald Fitch and Warren Callum, and a county judge and fence knockers over in the night, stood very still for exactly 1 second when Alfred's hands came to her face, and then she reached up and held his wrists and kissed him back. And the wind off the mesa came through Cielo Rojo's main street and lifted the dust, and sent it spiraling in the peculiar golden light of a New Mexico afternoon. And the Reverend Crane, who happened to be coming out of the general store, stopped walking and blinked 3 times in rapid succession. Warren Callum, as it turned out, made his mistake the following week, just as Theresa had predicted. He came to the Harmon parcel himself this time, not with Hollowell, but alone, which Alfred later recognized was its own kind of signal, because a man like Callum came alone when he wanted to conduct business that he did not want witnessed. He rode up to the fence line on the east side in the early morning, when the light was still low and the shadows were long, and Theresa was at the cabin working on the window frames, and Alfred was on the far side of the parcel and heard the horse approach. Callum called out to Theresa. His voice carried across the valley flat. She set down her tools and walked to the fence line. She did not hurry. Alfred began walking toward them from his end of the parcel at a pace that would put him at the fence in about 2 minutes. Callum made his offer. He had raised it, $500. He said it with the tone of a man presenting a gift, and Alfred, approaching from the north, could see from Theresa's posture exactly what she thought of it. $500, she said. That's fair for the land, Mrs. Maddox, and I think you know it. The land is worth more than $500, she said. You know it too, which is why you want it. The land is difficult to work, he said, especially alone. I'm not alone, she said. Callum's gaze went to Alfred, who had arrived at the fence line and stood on Theresa's left at a respectful distance. Callum took Alfred in with the assessing look of a man recalculating again. Mr. Malone, he said, you work for Hargrove. I do, Alfred said. This isn't your land. It's not, Alfred agreed. Callum looked at Theresa. Mrs. Maddox. I want you to understand that I have been patient and reasonable, and that I have pursued every legal avenue available to me. The judge has ruled. I accept the judge's ruling. I am making you a business offer in good faith. I appreciate your acceptance of the judge's ruling, Theresa said, with an absolutely precise neutrality. My answer to your offer is the same as it has always been. I am not selling. There was a silence. The wind moved between them. Callum sat his horse with the stiff dignity of a man who has lost something he had already counted as his. And then, to his credit, and Alfred would grant him this much credit later, he nodded once and he said, I hope your well digs deep, and he turned his horse and rode back toward his own land. Theresa watched him go. Alfred watched her. After a moment she said, That's over. I think so, he said. He'll find another way to expand somewhere else, she said. He always does. Probably, Alfred said. He stepped over the fence into the parcel properly and stood beside her. How are the window frames coming? She looked at him sideways. Are you going to help with the window frames now? If you'll have me, he said. I'll have you, she said. And it was just 2 words about carpentry, and it was also something considerably larger than that. And they both knew it. And they walked back to the cabin together in the thin morning light, their shoulders almost touching, the wind at their backs. The following months were the kind of months that build things, and what they built was considerable. The cabin went from framing to walls to a roof before the summer heat peaked, and then through the summer they laid a stone floor and put in proper window glass that Theresa had ordered from the catalog at Horace Webb's, specifying the exact panes she needed with the kind of precision that caused Horace to mutter to himself about difficult customers while simultaneously admiring the efficiency. She built shelves and Alfred built a table from lumber he had milled at the small operation west of town, and between them they built the kind of small, solid home that announces its own permanence in every joint and corner. They dug the well with the help of Orville Meeks, who turned out to be an unexpectedly accomplished well digger, with opinions about soil strata that proved entirely accurate. The well hit water at 32 feet, which was better than anyone had expected, and Theresa stood at the edge of the shaft and dropped a stone and listened to the splash with an expression that Alfred would remember long after. Not triumphant, but deeply, quietly satisfied, as if the water at the bottom of the well was something she had known was there all along and had only needed to confirm. They rode into Cielo Rojo together most Saturdays, which became a fact of the town's life that the residents absorbed with the particular efficiency of small communities, accustomed to updating their understanding of who stood where and with whom. The hovering uncertainty that the women of the town had maintained toward Theresa began to resolve itself, partly because Margaret Orville, who was married to their neighbor and was a woman of practical sensibility, had declared Theresa to be extraordinarily capable, and only as difficult as any capable person had the right to be, and Margaret Orville's opinions carried weight. The one unexpected friendship was with a woman named Dolores Reyes, who was Mexican-American and who ran the smaller hat and dress shop at the south end of the main street, a business she had built from almost nothing after her husband had died 5 years prior, and after several of Cielo Rojo's citizens had made it very clear through various small unkindnesses that they would prefer she had built it elsewhere. Theresa had walked into Dollar's shop one afternoon looking for thread, and what she had found was a woman who understood the particular arithmetic of being a woman who intended to take up space, and was prepared to do the arithmetic anyway, and they had recognized each other with the efficiency of people who share a fundamental understanding and do not need to explain it. Theresa bought thread from Dollar's thereafter, and occasionally something more, and Dollar's came out to the parcel one September afternoon with tamales and the kind of forthright warmth that does not require prior relationship to express itself. And Alfred, who had been attempting to level the stone floor with varying success, found himself eating the best tamales he had experienced since Texas and listening to Dollar's and Theresa argue about the proper orientation of a kitchen garden with the amiable intensity of women who are enjoying themselves. That was the afternoon, Alfred thought later, when the parcel stopped feeling like a claim and started feeling like a place where people lived. He asked Henry Hargrove if he might reduce his hours to half-time in September, explaining the situation honestly, that he was spending most of his free time on the Harmon parcel, and that he expected his connection to that parcel to become official in the relatively near future, and that once it did, he would likely be farming rather than ranch-handing. Henry listened to all of this and said that he had seen it coming since the summer, and that he was glad Alfred had found his direction, and that the offer of half-time was accepted with the understanding that the other 2 hands he'd given that spring were still working full, and that the favor was thereby fully settled. Alfred went to Gerald Fitch's office on a Tuesday in late September and asked what the process was for adding a spouse to a homestead claim. Gerald looked at him, then at his papers, then at Alfred again, and then said, "Well, the claim is under Mrs. Maddox's name, and if she were to marry, the claim would continue under her new name and her husband would be co-claimant. And the land, it stays hers. It stays in the claim's name, which would then be the household's." "That's good," Alfred said. He had specific reasons for wanting to make sure of this, and he was glad to have them confirmed. He bought a ring from the traveling jeweler who came through Cielo Rojo twice a year, a modest silver ring with a small turquoise stone set in it, which he chose because it was the color of the sky over the Sandias at noon, and because he thought she would prefer it to gold, which would have seemed decorative in a way he did not think she was. He carried it for 4 days, which was longer than he intended, but which was the result of never finding quite the right moment, or so he told himself, though the truth was probably that he wanted to find the best moment, not just the right one, and these were different things. The best moment turned out to be completely unplanned, which in retrospect made perfect sense. It was an early October evening, with the heat finally beginning to give way to the first cool suggestion of fall, and they were sitting outside the cabin on the bench Alfred had built against the west wall, which caught the last light and the last warmth of the day as the sun went behind the mesa. They had eaten supper, and they were watching the sky go through its evening performance, which in New Mexico territory was not a modest production. It went from blue to gold to orange to a deep and particular violet that seemed to belong to that country specifically. Theresa had her head leaned back against the cabin wall and her eyes were open, watching the sky, and she was doing the thing she did sometimes that Alfred had come to love, which was to be entirely present without any need to speak or explain or fill the silence with anything, just to exist in the world with the whole quality of her attention. And he looked at her in the violet light, and knew this was the moment not because it was arranged, but because it was real. "Theresa," he said. She said, still watching the sky, "I have something I need to ask you." She turned her head and looked at him with those clear, storm cloud eyes. He took the ring from his shirt pocket and held it out in the evening light and said, "I am asking you to marry me, and I want to say very clearly before you answer that I am not asking because I think you need a husband to manage anything, because You manifestly do not. I am asking because I want to be your husband, which is a different thing, and because I believe we can build something here together that will be better than what either of us would build alone. Not because you are incomplete without me, but because two good things can make a third thing that is greater. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. The turquoise, she said. The sky at noon, he said. She reached out and took the ring from his hand, not to put it on but to look at it in the light, turning it in her fingers with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You will not try to manage my land." "No," he said. "You will not contradict me in front of people unless you have a genuinely good reason." "I will have good reasons when I contradict you," he said. "Always, but not many." She turned the ring again. "You will not tell me what I cannot do." "I will tell you when I think something is a bad idea," he said, "because I think you should have that, but I will not tell you what you cannot do." She looked at him. The last of the violet was leaving the sky and the first stars were arriving. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." She put the ring on herself, which was exactly right. They were married in November in Cielo Rojo's Tilted Cross Church, with Reverend Crane officiating and saying the words with a warmth that Alfred had not expected from him, though Theresa seemed unsurprised, having had a longer view of Reverend Crane's better qualities than his public performance suggested. Dolores Reyes stood with Theresa, and Henry Hargrove stood with Alfred, and Orville Meeks sat in the front pew and cried without any embarrassment whatsoever, which his wife Margaret noted afterward was really very sweet of him. The wedding was not a large affair, but it was attended by most of the town, partly because weddings in Cielo Rojo were not common events, and partly because a significant portion of the population had been watching the story develop since April with the absorbed interest of people who had nothing quite as interesting to read, and they felt, in some collective way, that they had a stake in the outcome. Warren Callum did not attend. He sent, through his foreman Dix Hollowell, a bottle of decent whiskey and a note that said simply, "Congratulations to the new Mrs. Malone." Whether this represented genuine goodwill or a tactical repositioning was a subject of debate in the Painted Crow for some weeks, but Alfred and Theresa drank the whiskey and found it satisfactory and left the debate to whoever wanted to conduct it. Theresa Malone, who had been Theresa Maddox and remained entirely herself by either name, moved her belongings properly into the cabin, which they finished together through the fall. The plastering of the interior walls, the installation of the iron stove that Alfred had ordered from the same catalog as her window glass, and the organization of the shelves and the placement of the table, and the hanging of the 2 oil lamps at angles that gave adequate light for reading in the evenings. She had brought with her from the wagon a small collection of books, her surveying notebook now filled with plans and notes for the land's development, a good cast-iron pot that had come with her from San Antonio, and a framed photograph of her parents from 1868, which she placed on the high shelf to the left of the door. They spent the winter working the land in the ways winter allows, planning the spring planting, repairing tools, learning each other's habits with the patient attention of 2 people who have chosen deliberately and are finding their choice confirmed at every turn. They argued sometimes because they were both people who said what they meant and meant substantial things, and the arguments were the kind that cleared the air and left the ground cleaner afterward than before. Alfred was right about the fence gauge on the south side and admitted it without performance. Theresa was right about the soil amendment in the eastern field and did not say so, which was more effective. By the second winter, the parcel had a proper structure to it. The cabin solid against the rock face, the well dependable 40 acres under cultivation with a mix of corn and hay, and a small herd of 8 cattle that Theresa had bought from a rancher south of town who was reducing his operation. The cattle were a breed suitable for the high desert, hardy and not particularly interested in human opinion about anything, and Theresa managed them with the same firm practicality she brought to everything else. Henry Hargrove rode out one afternoon in the second spring and stood at the fence line and looked at the parcel and said, without preamble, "You've done something good here." "We've done something good," Theresa said, standing beside Alfred on the inside of the fence. Henry looked at Alfred with the expression of a man who has seen someone find what they were looking for and is pleased about it. "You coming back to full-time ever?" he asked. "I think I'm where I'm supposed to be," Alfred said. Henry nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode back toward his own land, which was the full extent of the commentary he felt was necessary. The second spring also brought something Alfred had not quite known how to hope for, which was the news, delivered by Theresa with the particular no-nonsense quality she brought to all significant information, that she was expecting a child. She told him one morning in April, which was 1 year after she had first driven into Cielo Rojo, and she told him standing in the kitchen portion of the cabin, with the morning light coming through the new window glass and her good cast-iron pot on the stove, and she watched his face with the clear-eyed attention she always gave him. He sat down at the table, which was not a thing he often did in the middle of the morning, and he put his hands flat on the table's surface and looked at them and then looked at her and found that he did not have words immediately available, which was not entirely usual for him, and she watched him with the particular patience she reserved for things that mattered. "Well," he finally said. "Well," she agreed. "Well," he said again, and then he stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her carefully, which made her laugh because she said she was expecting a child, not made of something fragile, and she put her arms around him properly, and they stood together in the morning light, and Alfred had the overwhelming sensation of being exactly where every road in his life had been going without knowing it. He went to tell Dolores Reyes, who said she had been wondering when they would get around to it, and that she intended to make something for the child and that Theresa should eat more and sleep more, neither of which Theresa subsequently did to any noticeable degree, but she appreciated the intention. The summer of the second year was hard in the way New Mexico summers are hard, which is to say the heat was absolute, and the water in the creek ran low, and the garden needed constant attention that Theresa provided with increasing efficiency and decreasing comfort as the months progressed. She did not slow down as much as Alfred would have preferred, which he mentioned twice and then did not mention again, because the first time she had looked at him with complete patience and explained that she was not incapacitated, and the second time she had not said anything but had given him a look that expressed the same information more concisely. He compensated by doing the heavier work before she rose in the morning and after she went to bed at night, which she knew and chose not to comment on, and this was its own kind of agreement. The child was born in November, a boy, in the cabin with Dolores Reyes assisting, and the doctor from 3 towns over who Theresa had arranged to be available 3 weeks in advance, because she had arranged everything 3 weeks in advance. The labor was long and Alfred spent most of it outside because there was genuinely nothing useful for him to do inside, and being where he could not see what was happening was only marginally worse than being where he could. And Orville Meeks happened to ride over mid-afternoon, and they sat together on the bench against the west wall, and Orville talked about cattle and fence and the quality of that season's hay, which was kind of him. When Dolores opened the door and said it was done, and that both Theresa and the child were well, and that Alfred could come in, he went inside and found his wife propped against the headboard of the bed they had moved from the main room months ago in preparation, looking tired in the way that people look tired after they have done something enormous, and in her arms was a child, his son, small and red-faced, and expressing a very emphatic opinion about the world with every tool available to him. "He has your stubbornness," Dolores said from the other side of the room, gathering linens. "He's howling his head off 5 minutes into life," Theresa said, looking at the child with an expression Alfred had never seen on her face before and immediately recognized as something entirely new. "I think that's Alfred's contribution." "I have never howled at anything in my life," Alfred said. The first time you found that fence on the east corner knocked over, the noise you made was considerable. I said 2 words. Loudly, she said, and she looked up at him, and the new expression and the old Theresa were there together in her face, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put his son into his arms, and he held the child carefully, the way he had once moved a wire roll with her, with the full concentrated attention of something that mattered completely. And the boy looked up at him with dark, indignant eyes and then settled slowly into something approaching consideration. And Alfred thought that this was, without any contest, the finest thing he had ever held. They named him James, for Theresa's first husband, which Alfred had suggested and meant genuinely, and Joseph for Alfred's father, and he was called James from the day of his birth, with the single-syllable certainty of a name that fit. James Malone grew up on the Harmon land, which was called the Malone parcel now in the local habit of naming land after its inhabitants, and grew up under 2 things simultaneously: his mother's complete and unsentimental confidence in what he was capable of and his father's steady, patient attention to the particular shape of who he was becoming. The combination proved, over time, to be a very good one. Cielo Rojo changed as the decade turned. The railroad pushed through a larger town 30 miles north, which drew some business away and also brought new people south to the valley, people looking for land and work, and the particular quality of possibility that the territory still offered even as it was beginning to be organized and settled in ways that the old wild ran from. Warren Callum expanded, as he always did, but he expanded southward now, having evidently accepted that the northeast valley was not his to have, and while he was never a friend to the Malones, he was also, after the first years, not an active problem. The injustice of how he had expanded generally, the pressures he had applied to smaller claimants, and the way he had used legal mechanisms to exhaust people without recourse, those things did not disappear from the record of how the valley had been built. And Theresa, who had a precise memory and a strong sense of what was fair, noted them clearly when asked. But she had her own land to tend, and that tended to focus the attention. Dolores Reyes expanded her shop in 1884 and hired 2 young women to help her, which was the beginning of a slightly larger story that belonged to Dolores, and which Theresa supported by being the kind of friend who shows up when showing up counts and stays out of the way when that counts more. Gerald Fitch retired in 1886 and was replaced by a woman from Las Vegas, New Mexico, named Clara Huang, who was the first female land registrar in the county, and whom Theresa visited on her second day in office to welcome her, and to have a brief, warm conversation about the particular advantages of knowing your maps better than the people who came in to argue with you. Horace Webb continued to run the general store and continued to fall short on flour weights until 1885, when Theresa submitted a formal complaint to the County Weights and Measures Office, after which he became scrupulously accurate, which the whole town benefited from whether or not they knew the reason. The Hargrove spread changed hands in 1887, when Henry Hargrove died quietly in his sleep at the age of 64, which was a considerable loss, and Alfred went to the service and sat in the Tilted Cross Church, and thought about all the ways a decent man makes the world work better without requiring recognition for it. In the years that followed, Alfred and Theresa worked the land through drought and through good seasons, through the kind of cattle losses that come with hard winters, and through the gradual successful development of the parcel into something that produced reliably and fed its family, and generated enough surplus to sell. They worked together the way people work together when they have found the particular rhythm of their shared life, not always in the same direction, not always without friction, but always with the fundamental understanding that this was the project and they were both committed to it. In 1888, Theresa told Alfred there would be another child, and Alfred sat down at the table again in exactly the same way as the first time, which made Theresa laugh outright, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and he stood up and held her, and this time he did not try to make her slow down because he had learned by then that the most useful thing he could do was be where she needed him and not worry about the rest. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1889, with her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's tendency toward unreasonable stillness when she was thinking. They named her Alina, and she arrived in the world with considerably more composure than James had managed, opening her eyes and looking around with a watchful alertness that caused Dolores, who was again in attendance, to say that this one was going to be trouble in the most admirable sense, which proved accurate. James was 7 when Alina was born, and was serious about her from the beginning in the way that certain children take to having a sibling, as if they had been waiting for it. Alfred watched his son hold his daughter for the first time with the carefully folded arms and concentrated expression of a child trying to do something important correctly, and he felt the accumulation of every good thing that had happened in the last 7 years pressed into a single moment, almost more than a man could carry without spilling. Theresa recovered from Alina's birth with the same efficient pragmatism she brought to everything, was back at the fence line within a week, which caused the doctor from 3 towns over to express an opinion she politely declined to act on, and had Alina in a sling on her back within 2 weeks, which caused Dolores to say she had married a force of nature. And Alfred, who overheard this, said that was in his experience an accurate description. The parcel was full by the summer of 1889. Full in the way places get full when they have been properly inhabited, with the evidence of years, the worn path from the cabin to the well, the garden that had expanded 3 times from its original plan, the cattle barn that Alfred had built in 1885 with cedar posts that would outlast all of them, the fence lines that ran true and solid and had not been knocked over by anyone in 7 years. The cabin itself had been extended twice, once eastward to add a proper bedroom for James as he grew, and once upward with a half-loft that became Alina's particular domain in her childhood, reached by a ladder that she climbed with a fearlessness that her parents each, independently, thought was her mother's contribution. Alfred had a habit, in the long July evenings when the days were at their longest and the light lasted until nearly 9 o'clock, of sitting on the bench against the west wall of the cabin and watching the land in the evening light. It was the same bench he had built in the 2nd year, maintained and repaired through the seasons, and it faced west toward the mesa and the particular sky above it, and he would sit there with coffee and let the day settle in his body and take account of things. Theresa joined him when the children were in bed, and they sat together on the bench the way they had from the beginning, often without much conversation because they had discovered long ago that they did not need conversation to be together, that the quality of their shared silence was its own communication. The children growing, the cattle grazing in the evening cool, the sound of the creek running in the cottonwoods to the east. One evening in the July of 1890, with James 8 and Alina just past 1 and asleep inside and the mesa going gold in the last sun, Alfred said, "Do you remember what people said about you when you first came to Cielo Rojo?" Theresa was quiet for a moment. "That I was too stubborn to settle," she said. "That's what they said," he confirmed. She turned and looked at him in the evening light, and there was something in her eyes that was the full depth of the last 8 years. The fence posts and the survey and the county seat and Gerald Fitch's stamp and the tamales and the tilted cross church and James's birth and Alina's composure and all the mornings and evenings between. "They were wrong about what stubborn means," she said. "They were," he agreed. "Stubborn isn't not settling," she said. "Stubborn is knowing what you're building and building it anyway, no matter what." He looked at the land spread out in front of them, the fence lines running true, the cabin solid at their backs, the first stars arriving in the east. He thought about the morning he had ridden into Cielo Rojo from the north on the bad road, and the wagon he had noticed because it was well kept, and the woman he had met in Horace Webb's store over scattered coffee beans. He thought about the way she had poured the recovered beans into his open bag, the small domestic gesture of it, and how even then, without knowing anything, something in him had known. "Do you know what I thought?" he said. "The first time I saw you on this land, before you knew I was there." She looked at him. "I thought, she's counting her steps. She's measuring what she's building before she's built it." He looked at the parcel, at the fence and the well and the barn and the garden that all ran in the lines she had marked out with her heel-to-toe steps 8 years ago. "You had it right from the start." The wind came in from the southwest, the warm evening wind that carried sage and the smell of the irrigated ground and something that was almost rain and was this time actually rain, because the summer rains had finally arrived and the air had the particular electricity of a sky with intention. "You should know," Theresa said, "that I saw you that day, when you were watching. I counted your footsteps when you turned your horse." He turned and looked at her. "I heard you arrive, and I heard you stop, and I heard you turn to leave," she said, with the particular precision that meant she was telling him something she had held for a long time. "And the reason I did not call out was not because I did not see you. It was because I was—" She paused. She was not often searching for words, and when she was, he knew to wait. "I was measuring, too." The first drops of rain came out of the southwest, warm and smelling of everything the desert saves itself for, and they sat on the bench together in the gathering rain, the mesa going to purple in the storm light, and from inside the cabin came the small sound of a leaner stirring, and then the low, steady voice of James, 8 years old and already in possession of his father's particular quality of calm, telling his sister that it was all right, just rain, just the summer rain, go back to sleep. They listened to it for a moment, James's voice patient and steady, Alina quieting, the rain coming properly now, straight and warm, drumming on the roof they had made together. Theresa leaned her shoulder against Alfred's, and he put his arm around her, and felt her settle against him the way a person settles when they are where they belong. And the rain came, and the mesa went dark, and the parcel filled with the smell of wet earth, and the south wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek with a sound like something rushing toward something it had been looking for. Alfred thought about what she had said. Stubborn is knowing what you're building and building it anyway. And he thought about what he had said to her on the morning of the fence, that stubborn things did not blow away in this wind. And he thought that he had been right. And he was glad, more than he had words for, that he had been right about exactly that one thing at exactly that one moment, because everything that had come from it, the years and the work and the children and the bench in the evening rain, was the best thing he had ever had the sense to stand firm about. The rain fell on Cielo Rojo and on the mesa and on the parcel that had been called Harmon and was now called Malone, and the creek ran and the fence held, and inside the cabin the children slept, and the 2 people who had built it all sat together in the warm summer rain and said nothing, which was everything. The land was hers. The life was theirs. The wind blew as it always did, and the stubborn things held.